My name is John Telfer and I'm the Product Director of Explore Worldwide. And in this first section of the course I'd like to explain about how risk has affected us, what we've learnt, the instance that we've had to go through, and how we've applied that to how we operate our business in the hope that you can learn from us. But first of all, I'd like to talk briefly about how we first met up with GIZ. I received an email from Danny Denolf asking whether we were interested in setting up a training program for the extended supply chain. I read it and I couldn't believe it. I thought, this is amazing. This is exactly what we want. So he came over for 2 days and talked about what we wanted together, what we wanted to achieve, and he went back to discuss that with his superiors, and we eventually came to agreement at the end of last year. So I'm very happy to be involved in this project, very excited indeed. Before I continue, I want to talk a little bit about us so you can understand our experiences and put into context what I'm about to say. So we operate small group adventures up to 18 people around the world, and we've been operating these tours for 36 years. The average age of our customer is in their 50s. They're very interested in the destinations, and we go worldwide. 130 countries, 600 different itineraries, 30,000 customers, with over 200 tour operators, or ground agents as we call them, people like you. Each tour has a tour leader which we train. The average duration of each trip is around 1 week to 3 weeks, and we've got a base in the UK in Farnborough of 130 staff. We do cycling trips, we do discovery trips, we do walking and trekking trips, and we do trips especially for families. But the basic thing is that we want people to see the true country, to get a real experience, to see beneath the surface and not just to see the touristy things. That's enough about us. Let me talk a little bit about what we've experienced and the fact that your past doesn't necessarily define your future when it comes to risk. The fact that nothing has happened doesn't mean nothing will happen in the future. So, for example, think about Russian roulette. You may have squeezed the trigger 4 times and nothing has happened, but there's still a risk there. You may know somebody that doesn't wear a safety belt. They could say, well, I've never had an accident. That's just luck. If they wait long enough, then that safety belt will be valuable. The other thing I've learned is that when things do go wrong, and it doesn't matter how good your risk management is, things will go wrong. It's important to see why they went wrong and if there's anything to learn, and then apply that to your business model. The main thing is sometimes when a risk is relatively small, the chances of it happening to one person in a year is quite small, but if you've got 1,000 people doing the same thing, it's likely to happen. The problem is when people don't know that they're doing something risky, or alternatively they don't know of a better way of doing things that reduces that risk, and that is what I'm going to talk about today. People, when they think about the risks to themselves or their business, often don't understand the risk, and also they think that the risk is much smaller than it actually is. There was a survey in the USA about hurricanes and how it would impact their businesses. They went to a number of different organizations in a number of different towns, all of which are in the hurricane area. And when they brought all the information together, the average response from each person was, it won't hit our area. Well, we know that a certain number of hurricanes are going to hit that area each year, but each individual thought it won't hit my specific area. And also they thought, well, it's not likely to hit our town, but of course towns will be hit in that area. The next interesting thing was when asked if it did hit their town, is it likely to hit their business? And they thought, no, it's not. and even if it does hit the business, it won't affect me as much as others. If those are the average responses, if you put them all together, it just can't be true, because it is going to hit a certain area, it is going to hit a certain town, it is going to hit a business, and it is going to put them out of business. So think about your understanding of risk, the risk that your business takes. With risk management, it's not about just stopping things, it's about looking at how you do certain things. And what will happen is that the number of incidents will reduce, which can be a bit frustrating because it's quite difficult to prove when you have good risk management and you don't have accidents. Because of that, it's very difficult to prove it, and it can be quite difficult to discuss this with people, because sometimes it requires time and effort, and if you haven't had anything happen in the past, people might think, well, it's never happened in the past. But remember, just because something hasn't happened in the past doesn't mean it won't happen in the future. We did an exercise a few years ago where we looked at the whole world and we thought, in the last few years, what has happened to us as a business. So first of all, we looked at where have our tours been affected by drought or famine, and we had Ethiopia and Kenya in Eastern Africa. Then we thought, what about recent vehicle accidents? We had a boat sink in the Galapagos, a truck roll in Tanzania, a coach crash in Malaysia. I'll talk about some of these incidents later on to show you what we learned. Then we thought, what about terrorism or war? This is the next set of countries. And then we thought, what about Mother Nature, earthquakes, hurricanes, volcanoes exploding? So as you can see, practically every country that we go to has had something significant happen, and we're affected by these because we're a relatively large company, whereas if we're a smaller company, we might be shielded by what might happen if we just operated in one country. When it comes to risk, people don't necessarily understand it. There was a survey in the UK very recently, this was in August 2017, and they said, what are the biggest concerns for you as somebody that lives in the UK? What came first was terrorism, and secondly was investment in healthcare, in hospitals. Now, you think about that for a second and think about, well, how many people does terrorism kill in the UK on an annual basis? It's tiny. And how many people die due to issues in hospitals or not getting to doctors or hospitals in time? It's huge, but people's perception of risk is that terrorism is the danger, whereas there are other things that really you should be thinking about. The other thing, what kills more people on an annual basis? Is it people texting whilst driving, or terrorism plus shark attacks plus earthquakes? And it's texting. I try to put these into context by thinking about our company as a village. We have 30,000 people travel with us each year. Each tour on average is 12 days long. That means we've got 360,000 customer days overseas. Now if you divide that by the number of days in the year, let's call that 360, that means we're looking after a standing village of 1,000 people. True, we don't have the sick in there, or the very old, or the very young, but we're looking after 1,000 people constantly. And what's going to happen to those 1,000 people? Yes, you might get the strange and the unusual, a balloon crashing out of the sky or a ship sinking, but actually the things that will happen to our customers generally are the things that will happen back here. It could be a coach crash, a car crash, it could be heart attacks, it could be a slip and a trip in a bathroom. The important thing is to think, what is the risk and how many people will it affect? If you have a vehicle with 2 people in it compared to a coach with 16 people in it, obviously if the vehicle has an accident, you're going to have 16 people affected rather than 2. So where should you apply your efforts? Should it be on everything, or should you start at those things where if there is an accident, then it's going to affect the most people? So my recommendation is that when you look at your risk management, look at those things where the whole group will be affected. That's transport, and that's accommodation, and that's vessels. People, when they think about Friday the 13th, in many cultures it's a day where unlucky things happen. Sometimes people are more careful on Friday the 13th than they are on other days. There's some evidence that says actually the number of accidents that happen on Friday the 13th is less than on a normal day because people are more aware. So think about and understand risks and take appropriate action, but base it on facts, not on gossip, not on what you believe right now, but after a bit of research. Sometimes when there is an accident, you can make the wrong decision. After September the 11th tragedy, when all those people were killed when 2 planes crashed into the Trade Towers, a lot of people in the US, rather than fly domestically, they decided to drive. Now, because driving is more dangerous than flying, actually more people died in the years after September the 11th due to road crashes than if they'd flown. So it was an obvious reaction to avoid flying because of what happened, but actually the risk they took by driving instead was much higher. Sometimes you have to make tough decisions. Now, many years ago, when Hurricane Katrina hit the USA, Houston was evacuated. Now, just evacuating Houston to get people away from the hurricane, where around 100 people died in that evacuation. Nothing to do with the hurricane. In fact, the hurricane didn't hit Houston. This time round, just last week, when the hurricane was approaching Houston, they decided not to evacuate the city because the risk of deaths from evacuation was going to be higher than those saved. Example, the big hurricane that just hit the southern states, around 50 people died. So it's that balance between what are the risks, what are the impacts, what should you do, what's proportionate, what's reasonable. What we should do as a tour operator is understand the risk that we take to avoid the avoidable, but also knowing that even if we're reasonable in how we operate our tours, then sometimes we will be unlucky and we will have accidents and incidents. So how do we deal with these? We know they're going to happen, we want to reduce the number, but do you have a plan in place? A couple of years ago I went on holiday in England to Exeter. Lovely place, as you can see there. But nowadays, when people fall over and they can blame somebody, they will sue. So what the local people have to do, local council, they have to have signs saying be careful when you're walking because the surface is slippery. This is an overreaction in my view, but we'll come back to issues on people falling over and how much that might cost the tour operator in a moment. So right by this sign I stayed in the oldest hotel in Britain and it burnt down. Fortunately, because there were fire alarms, because there were signs saying which way to go in case of fire, nobody was injured. So if the fire alarms had not worked, if the fire escapes were locked, if people didn't know how to evacuate in the middle of the night, there'd have been far more deaths. Now these are the things I want you to think about. But the other thing is, when people do damage themselves and they can blame the tour operator, that's you or I, how much can it potentially cost? I'll give you an example. Somebody in South Africa fell and broke her leg. She could blame the hotel for that fall, and she was awarded £55,000. That's roughly what, 60,000 euros nowadays, or around 70,000 US dollars. So it's so important that things are done in the right way to first of all reduce the risk of things happening, and also to protect your reputation and also costs. Let's talk about why a bit more. why we should think about risk management. And actually, let's start off with why we would not bother. And this is all down to understanding. So the classic reason for not bothering to think about risk management or instance is, I don't have the time to do it. Second thing is, people might not be aware of the risks that they're taking with their business and with their customers. Many times people don't know what to do or how to do it. We didn't originally. And the last two here, it has never happened to me. Looking back into the past, because nothing has happened, it won't happen in future, which is just wrong. So lastly, it will never happen to me. That's because you think you're too good, too professional. There's a certain amount of arrogance, and that applied to us as well. Looking at it more positively for a moment, why should we bother to think about risk management? Why should we do it? Given it will take us time, given we have to think about things which are negative and dark and we might not want to think about them, why should we bother? Number one for me, it's to reduce the number of incidents. Secondly, if you reduce the number of incidents, well, people that suffer from a fall, or if there's a car crash, obviously that makes people unhappy. So by reducing the number of incidents, it makes people happier overall. When something does happen, such as a crash, a fire, this takes a lot of time to resolve. So it's more efficient for you as a business if the number of incidents is reduced. The next one people don't often think about is how it affects your reputation. If you have incidents, this will damage the reputation of not just you as a tour operator, but potentially tourism in your country. So by having good risk management procedures in place, this will protect and enhance your reputation. And this one is key for me. For me, I want to operate in a safe way. I want people to have a fantastic time. I don't want to go to sleep at night worrying about the risks that I'm taking. I want to understand the risks, accept them, and sleep well. Think about how other people in your industry will look at you if you've got risk management. It gives you a professional image, also to your staff, also to the customers that travel with you. If you have less incidents, it means there'll be less litigation, and also if you have risk management procedures in place, it will reduce the severity of incidents. Therefore, compensation will be reduced. And if you're going to a partner in Europe and you don't have a risk management system in place, and you compare that to somebody who does have a risk management system in place, well, you're not going to do as well. By having an understanding of risk, by understanding safety, the chances of somebody working with you from many countries is much higher if you don't do anything at all. So it's your commercial advantage. If you have insurance in many places, if you control your risk well, then your insurance costs will be lower. But last, and certainly not least, actually first, the reason you should do all this is because of these people here. I really want to highlight one thing, and that is, it's not just about the customers that you're looking after, that your lifeblood to your business. It's not just your customers, it's the tour leaders, it's the drivers, it's the hoteliers, it's your own staff, it's everybody. So I believe we have a moral duty to understand what risks we're taking, to make sure these people have a happy and safe trip to your country. A good place to start understanding some of the risk is to look at the British government's Foreign and Commonwealth websites. The web address is there, and there they detail political risk, natural risk for all countries outside the UK. After this session is finished, I recommend you go online and have a look to see what our country says about yours. Again, you may not agree with it, but it's a good place to start. It's detailed and it's well set out. People think about rules, guidelines, regulations, but also about communication. And it's so important that your guides report back to you when they see something wrong, something dangerous, when a fire escape is blocked, that your staff feel comfortable to report to you if they see some dangerous practices. But also think about your guides that are taking the groups around. It's so important about the briefings. It shows that your staff are professional, that you're a professional company, and it will prevent accidents. So it's so important people talk about wearing safety belts, if it's an activity, to go through what the procedures are, tell people how to behave culturally. I'll give you one example, and this is an extreme example, and this is something. The other thing about communication is when something happens, make sure it's reported back to you. We had an incident in South Africa where we had a group that closely avoided being burnt in a forest fire. Now, the tour leader, the guide, thought, well, it's fine, they weren't injured physically. He never bothered to tell us. So when they came back, they picked up the phone and very angry and said, you never contacted us. We almost died. We were frightened and scared. Call yourself a professional tour operator. I apologised and said, I'm very sorry, we didn't know about it. So it's so important that you train your staff to tell you when something happens, whether it's an actual instance that affects people or whether it's something called a near miss, something that almost happened. Make sure that they come back to you and tell you. The other thing is about language. A lot of guidelines are in English. It's important that you understand what's been explained to you in these sessions and to ask when you don't. It's also important that your staff understand. This is a very strange example, but in Britain, in Wales, it has its own language and all signs have to be in English and then also in Welsh. That's the sentences at the bottom part of the sign. Not everybody speaks Welsh, so the person that wrote this sign, no entry for heavy good vehicles, residential site only, he emailed this to the translator, he got a reply back, he put it and sent it to the sign maker, and he printed this sign. Now, what that translation at the bottom actually says is, I'm sorry, I'm out of the office, I'll respond to your email on Monday. So the lesson here is make sure you understand what we are saying and to challenge us. Secondly, when you're talking to your staff, make sure they understand as well. We'll talk later on about how to reduce incidents. Remember, that was the main reason for what we're doing. But also recognise that things will go wrong. They will go wrong. And what happens when things go wrong. In the old days, when there's a major incident, I say a major incident is anything involving deaths, serious injury, there's something called the golden hour where you had time to get all your facts, to get the people into the office, to arrange who was saying what. But now, with modern technology, with drone technology, with YouTube, if there is an accident, you can guarantee that there will be video footage online within minutes in many areas if it happens in a town, more if it's somewhere more remote. You have to be prepared. You have to be prepared. And there's a few questions now that I'd like you to think about. I'm not going to answer any of them. These are for you to have a look at. Think about when an incident is going to happen. Is it going to happen in working hours when you have the staff there? I don't know what your working hours are, but in Britain, roughly, working day is 8 hours long. It's a bit longer, but let's make it 8 hours long. So that's a 8 hours out of 24 hours chance of getting somebody in the office, and then you have weekends as well. So the chances of an incident happening in office hours is less than a third. So, do you have a 24-hour duty manager? Do you have one when that person is away? Do you have a checklist so you don't have to think about what to do when an incident happens? Do you know where the hospitals are? If there's a major incident, will your telephones be jammed by people calling in? And are your staff trained to deal with sensitive issues? Is there a dedicated crisis team if you're a largest organisation? Who's going to do everything if you're a small organisation? Are you used to dealing with journalists and the media? At the end of the event, will your reputation be damaged or enhanced? And do you have people with language skills? And do you know who they are? I'd like you to think about all these things. Again, this is when an incident happens. Next, safety awards. You might think, well, I've just shown you those. And the reason being is that many years ago we were audited and we thought we were very good at risk management. And actually at the end of the audits they said you're okay here, you're poor there, and that was totally different from what we were expecting. And that was a combination of arrogance and ignorance. Now that leads me to the next question. Who are the most dangerous people? And this is my answer, at least. People that don't know what they're doing is dangerous, as you could see on some of those pictures I showed you just now. Dangerous to themselves and also to others. Why are they dangerous? It can be a combination of two things, and that's arrogance and ignorance. So these courses with us on risk management, it's all about finding out where you are ignorant, as we were, about what we were doing and how we were doing it and how we could learn. And the other important thing is to look at the people around you, look at the people that you might want to work with or not work with, and are they flexible, are they willing to learn, or do they believe just because it's never happened to them, it will never happen in future. In summary, as a company, this is what we learned: to understand exactly what we were doing, where we needed some training, a good understanding of who we are working with in remote-ish locations and where we weren't working direct, the extended supply chain, the need to have safety guidelines, which we'll talk about later on in the modules, and therefore by following these guidelines reducing incidents, and that way at the end of it to be better placed to protect our reputation, our staff and our customers. And I'm not going to read this out, I've said it 2 or 3 times before. Always have plans, make sure that you don't rely on the past to predict the future. And the other thing is, when there is an incident and you get that first report, always believe that the situation will get worse. Might be just minor injuries when you first hear about it, assume it will get worse, and that way you'll be prepared. A reminder, why are you doing these courses. And for me, the reason why you should be here listening to what we've learned is to reduce the number of incidents. When there are incidents, to reduce how severe those incidents are, and to think about having a plan when you eventually have an incident. And finally, to learn from how you've dealt with incidents. Our first major incident was a kidnapping in Yemen in 1998. A number of our group were kidnapped and a number of people died. It was absolutely tragic. We had difficult conversations with all sorts of people, with distressed relatives. We had journalists knocking on our door. We dealt with the situation compassionately and sympathetically. We gave journalists information, and we came out of it having learned an awful lot. We got a lot of things right, but that was more good luck rather than any plan that we had. After this incident, we wrote down plans on how to deal with different incidents, and the need to get somebody out there whenever there's an incident. Flew somebody out to Yemen. It happens any time now. We have an instance, we assume it's going to get worse, we send somebody out there, and you should consider that in country as well, to make sure that we had a plan, and also to practice that plan, to make sure the telephone numbers were correct, to see how people would react. September the 11th, it first started with one plane flying into one of the Twin Towers, then two. Awful tragedy. Then airspace was shut down, where people stranded all over the world. Our phones were overwhelmed. That's when we started to use the website, when there were incidents, to make sure people were updated on our website about what was happening, to try to reduce the anxiety of not knowing, speed of a response, and also to make sure our phone lines were open. The ash cloud in Iceland when the volcano Eyjafjallajökull exploded. I was sitting in a restaurant in London, heard about it on the news. Flights had been cancelled for an hour, then it became 2 hours, then 4 hours, then a day, then 2 days, and then it was a week or so later, before airspace opened again. So always assume that things will get worse. The tsunami in the Indian Ocean back in 2004, that happened on Boxing Day. First calls about 5 o'clock in the morning. First of all, there was a tidal wave, and then we discovered that was going to impact on Thailand, and then Sri Lanka and India and all those countries in that basin. So it got worse and worse and worse. The other thing is, when you have a big incident, this is not tough work dealing with it for 8 hours or 12 hours. This is 24 hours a day, and it could be for multiple days. So think about, if there is an incident, how you would deal with that. These are some of the things that we learnt. Make sure that when there's a crisis that you call people into the office, make sure you know where they are, have the ability to post messages on websites, make fast decisions on how people are being looked after, and always assume that it'll get worse before it gets better in each and every situation. We had a case in Turkey where a balloon crashed, multiple injuries. At first the injuries didn't seem severe. We flew somebody out there. In the end, there were broken backs, a fatality. Our local agent, our local tour operator, was fantastic. The press were involved, and everybody worked together. That happened at 5 o'clock in the morning, and our agent, our local tour operator, had been trained to help out, and which was trying to share some of this training that we've shared with some of our tour operators, but across your countries. Another phone call at 5 o'clock in the morning. A coach had come off the road in Malaysia. We called the emergency team to the office. We sent somebody to the airport, and what happened is that a coach had been going around a corner in the rain. it came off the road, tumbled, fell into a lake which had sewage in it. Everybody had broken ribs, there were broken backs, multiple injuries. People were evacuated to 3 different hospitals. At first we thought the injuries were minor, but as we got more and more information, the situation became more and more severe. But we'd already decided, right, let's assume this is going to get worse. Let's put a plan in place, which is exactly what we did. So, when you're looking at who deals with crises, get people from different parts of the business and have backups. Remember, it's going to be 24 hours a day, and it's important to get people out to the scene. And if in any doubt, don't wait, because it'll be too late or delay. Always send somebody. It's the right thing to do for the customers and for your business. Where should the effort be, prevention or cure? Difficult, but I believe there's a balance. And with the courses that we'll be presenting, we'll try to explain what we learned. The key thing is to understand what you are doing, what activities are being offered, whether it's included or optional. Optional is very important as well, because you'll have responsibility for dealing with it, even if it's not part of the package. Make sure you know exactly where it's happening and what the guidelines are, what are the best ways of having these activities, and making sure you know who is providing that activity. And finally, if it goes wrong, when it goes wrong, what the consequences, and do you have a plan? So you must know your operating environment. Make sure you train your staff. Look after your staff. It's difficult when there's an incident, it's emotional, it's stressful. Make sure that you look after them and make sure you have a plan in place and it's tested. And if you think of one thing, then put your customers' emotional and physical well-being at the top of the priority list, and also their friends and family. That is where you should start to be thinking about their well-being, emotional and physical. Not just our customers, your customers, but also your staff and their families. Wrapping up the section, prepare for the worst, prepare for it to happen out of office hours, prepare for an incident to get worse, and then after the incident is finished, review, see what you could have done better, see what your partners could have done better. The unusual can happen, but remember, it's the normal things that will happen most of the time. Transport, accommodation, boats. Concentrate your efforts on groups, large groups of people, rather than small groups first, but then spread out what you learn. And remember, the unusual can always happen. This was Tbilisi 2 or 3 years ago, where there were massive floods, sad deaths, and animals from the zoo escaped. Remarkable. What might seem impossible to you may become possible. And I'm not saying plan for something as unusual as this, but think about things that you do, the transport that you provide, the itineraries you provide, the activities you provide. What can you do to understand the risk? What can you do to run them professionally? And when it does go wrong, would you have a plan? You must have a plan. Thank you so much for your attention, and I hope that's been useful for you. Thank you.